Hey friends, welcome to Carly and the Christian Cowboy, episode 4. If you haven't listened to episode 1, 2, and 3, I suggest you do that. And if you like free stories and you like stories that you can listen to with your children or your Grammy in the car, hit the like and subscribe button. Thank you for being here. Here we go. Even though Christian had showered and scrubbed as best he could, he still had the cow's blood in his fingernails. In the sterile hospital with its stark white walls, he felt as out of place as a chimpanzee in a church. Your mother is in a medically induced coma, Dr. Schaefer told Christian. They stood in the hall beside the nurse's station. The door to his mom's room stood open, and he could see her lying still and lifeless in a shaft of sunlight. Had he ever seen his mother lying down in the middle of the day? She had worked hard her entire life. Maybe it was time for her to rest. Her body needs time to heal, Dr. Schaefer said, as if he had listened to Christian's words. Dr. Schaefer was a tall, austere man who spoke with a "I know best" attitude. You're welcome to visit. In fact, I would highly recommend doing so. Even though she may appear unresponsive, coma patients who are regularly visited by loved ones tend to recuperate faster. Christian cast a nervous glance into the light-filled room. What should I do? Talk to her. Hold her hand. Talk about your day. With a sigh, Christian strode into the room, pulled up a chair beside the hospital bed, and straddled it. He had no idea what to say. He as sure as heck wasn't going to tell her about the ripped-up cow. After a few minutes, he began to tell his mom all about Carly. The feed and grain store was adjacent to a nursery. Carly had thought she'd be bored after the few minutes it took her to pick out Perry's food, but the nursery drew her in. She happily wandered up and down the aisles, found a sickly-looking pepper plant on the bargain shelf, and put it in a shopping cart. Then she discovered a section of books on gardening, and she was soon lost in the pages of a book on herbs. Carly, Christian stood beside her. Are you ready to go? Carly reluctantly returned the book to the shelf. Christian watched her. What's that? A book on herbs. It was pretty fascinating. Of course, some of its claims have to be wild exaggerations. Wild exaggerations, Christian echoed. According to Dr. Weeks, the author of the book, herbs can cure almost anything. The exciting part is a lot of the herbs grow wild around here. She tapped her finger on his chest. And right now is prime foraging season. Foraging season, huh? Yep, the whole outdoors is nature's medicine cabinet. Christian plucked the book back off the shelf and put it in Carly's cart. What are you doing? I can't afford that. She moved to return it to the shelf. I can, and I'm buying it. Christian placed his hands on the cart and wheeled it toward the checkout counter. You can read it whenever you visit. Do you expect her to be at his house much? The girl at the counter, a pretty girl, probably in high school, gave Christian a flirtatious smile when he bought the book. You interested in herbs, Christian? She asked. He opened his wallet. I am now. I've been told the great outdoors is nature's medicine cabinet. My grandma has an herb garden, the girl said. I'd be happy to take you there sometime. Christian pocketed his wallet, picked up the book, and flipped it open. Thanks, but I'm more interested in foraging. The light in the girl's eyes dimmed, and she didn't say a word to Carly when she rang up the puppy chow. Christian, that girl was hitting on you, Carly said after they'd reached the parking lot. She watched Christian heave the heavy bag of chow into the back of his truck. What? Nah. Was he blushing? She couldn't tell because he ducked inside the cab. She climbed in and buckled up. Absolutely. She was probably hoping you'd invite her for foraging. Christian started the engine and put the truck into gear. I'm not foraging. You're foraging, he hesitated. Although, not alone. You can take Hannah or Eden with you. Who are you to decide who forages with me? Christian blew out a frustrated breath. This isn't Chicago, Carly. I know. Foraging in Chicago would be almost impossible. I spent the night cleaning up cow guts, Christian said in a hard voice. Carly stared at his profile. He really was beautiful. She melted a fraction. I'm sorry, Christian, you're right. Even if you take one of my sisters, you need to take bear spray with you. She nodded. He slid her a glance. I have a business proposition for you. A what? A business proposition, he repeated. I can't practice law in Washington until I pass the bar. But how would you feel about cooking dinner for my family until Mama gets back on her feet? Christian couldn't believe how seamlessly Carly fell into his life. Every day he'd work out on the ranch and come home to find Carly and Perry in the kitchen with some new recipe she'd be eager for him and his squirrely siblings to try. She acted as if he was doing her a favor. Sure, he was paying her, but her happiness not only took him by surprise, but, despite his worries about Mama, made him happy, maybe happier than he'd ever been. But one night, after walking Carly and Perry home and seeing them safely into the Wentworth homestead, an uncomfortable twitch of unease crawled down his spine. The sun hovered just above over the trees, and a breeze rustled through the tall grass and whistled in the nearby woods. Christian's gaze went to the bloody splotch of dirt where he'd found the slain cow. If a mountain lion successfully finds easy prey in a particular area, it might return to that spot if it perceives it as a reliable hunting ground. The last thing he wanted was for Carly or the Wentworth Ranch to become a mountain lion's territory. Christian instinctively put his hand on the knife tucked into his belt and strode across the pasture. The spine-tingling sense of being watched crawled over his skin. Banging through the back door, he stomped through the mudroom without removing his boots, unheard-of behavior if Mama had been home. He took the stairs to the basement 2 at a time, hurried past Hannah and Eden, who were both curled up on the sofa, watching one of those shows where people compete for some guy and go on lavish dates. Butch raised his head and thumped his tail, but didn't budge from his spot between the sisters. "Where are you going so fast?" Hannah called after him. He didn't answer because he didn't want to spook his sisters without any cause. Christian unlocked the gun cabinet, bypassed the .22, and pulled out the Winchester. He slipped a cartridge into the chamber and flipped on the safety. Both of his sisters and the dog turned their heads when he passed them again. "Keep Butch inside." "Be safe," Hannah called after him. "Can I go with you?" Eden asked, jumping up. "No," Hannah and Christian both said at the same time. Butch moved to follow, but Hannah grabbed his collar. Christian bolted up the stairs. He wasn't sure what made him run, but he found himself breathless by the time he reached the Wentworth homestead. He prowled around the barn, checking the locks on the stable. Steam rose from the slumbering horses. Inside the chicken coop, he found the flock all gathered into one crowded hutch, telling him that his instincts were right. There was a predator nearby, and the chickens knew it. The back door banged open, and Carly, dressed in that gauzy nightgown she wore, stepped out. Perry wiggled a greeting and darted between his legs, escaping. Christian dropped his gun into the dirt and captured the dog. "Keep him inside." With wide eyes, Carly considered the rifle lying beside Christian's boots. "What's up?" With Perry caught in his arms, Christian crossed the yard and climbed the porch steps. "Keep Perry inside," he repeated. He deposited the dog in the mudroom and closed the screen door. Perry whined at him and pressed his black nose against the screen. "Christian, what?" She broke off her question and pointed a wavering finger at the woods. "Eyes," she whispered. Christian whirled around, sprinted for the rifle, picked it up, and flipped off the safety. He fired a shot to the left. The crack split the air, birds cried, a branch snapped and tumbled to the earth. "You didn't aim at it," Carly said after a moment. "No, I just wanted to scare it." She stared at him and nodded with an open mouth. "Do you want to come in?" "No," he hesitated. "Will you be able to sleep?" "No." He motioned toward the porch swing. "Want to sit out here with me? Let me make some tea." Christian settled onto the swing and stared up at the dusky sky. The moon had risen above the trees, and the stars were gaining luster. Summer solstice had just passed. The days were long and the nights short. A few minutes later, Carly emerged with a tray carrying 2 steaming teacups and a platter of cookies. She had a quilt draped over one arm and a couple of pillows tucked under another. Christian bounced up to help her, and the swing rocked forward and bonked Perry on the head. Christian scooped up the dog and put him back in the house. "We're safe, but Perry isn't." Carly set the tray on the ground and frowned at it. Christian once again secured the dog behind the screen door. "I trust you not to run after a mountain lion. The dog, not so much." Perry whined and scratched the door, but Christian just shook his head at him. Carly picked up the teacups and handed one to Christian. "I don't even know if you like tea. I made yours the way I like mine." She settled onto the swing, tucked up her legs, and draped the quilt over it. Then I'm sure I'll like it. Christian cradled the teacup and took a sip. It tasted of lemon, cream, and honey. He nearly melted from the sweetness of it. Carly stared up at him as if she expected him to do something. "Leave the gun over there," she said after a long moment. Christian checked the gun's safety before propping it up against the porch railing. "Sit," Carly said. Christian sat beside her. The swing teetered under his weight. He felt stiff, awkward, and could smell the gun smoke on his hands and clothes. Carly put her hand on his thigh. "Christian, if it's not obvious, Christian," Seth called. "You all right? I heard the shot. Hannah told me there was a mountain lion." He emerged from the shadows. Christian had to clear his throat before speaking. "I'm okay," he called out. "I'll be home in a jiff." Seth glanced at them on the porch, and an embarrassed flush crawled over his cheeks. He had the .22 in his hands. Christian remained frozen on the swing. He longed to stay with Carly, but also wanted to reprimand his brother for bringing the shotgun. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, and not nearly the firepower needed for a large cat. "You better go," Carly said, removing the teacup from his hand. "Are you sure?" Christian's gaze flashed between her and his brother. "Will you be okay?" "I'll call if I hear anything," she reassured him. He stood, waffling. She also stood, and the swing banged against the back of his calves, telling him he needed to go. 3 weeks after Carly had first arrived, Mrs. Haywood returned from the hospital. Carly took her some freshly baked pies. Sitting at the table in the sunny kitchen, surrounded by her adoring family, Mrs. Hayward looked frail, but still beautiful. She eyed the apple pies Carly had brought over. "I hear you're trying to put me out of a job," she said. "No one could ever replace you." Carly put the pies on the counter and slipped off her baking mitts. Mrs. Haywood sniffed. "Well, there better be ice cream to go along with those pies." Everyone laughed. Seth bounced up to get a gallon of ice cream from the freezer. Hannah collected plates from the cupboard, and Eden found forks in the silverware drawer. Christian handed Carly a knife. "Is Christian paying you for all this cooking you've been doing for our family?" Mrs. Haywood selected a paper napkin from the basket and began to fold it into tiny squares, making Carly wonder if she found sitting still difficult. Carly cut into the first pie, and a puff of warm, cinnamon-scented goodness lifted into the air. "Of course, but I've been enjoying myself. Believe it or not, I enjoy baking." "I believe it," Mrs. Haywood said. "I could never understand people who don't like to cook. It's like saying you don't like to eat." "Exactly." Carly cut the pie into 6 slices and placed the slices on the plates Hannah provided. She served Mrs. Haywood first. Christian followed behind with a carton of ice cream and a scooper. He dropped a dollop onto his mom's plate. Mrs. Haywood took a bite and groaned with pleasure. "Now, tell me why you wanted to be a lawyer and not a baker." "I like to think I can do both." Carly dished up pie for Seth, Eden, Hannah, Christian, and finally herself. "Do you miss the city?" Mrs. Haywood asked. Carly leaned against the counter beside Christian and toyed with her pie. "Not at all, although I'll be glad when Daddy gets home. I don't like living alone." "You can always stay here," Mrs. Haywood offered. Hannah dropped her fork. "Mom, we only have 1 bathroom. And it's disgusting," Eden added. "Well, now, whose fault is that?" Mrs. Haywood wanted to know. Eden and Hannah both rolled their eyes. "I'm taking Carly out to see the old lavender fields tomorrow," Christian said. "It's a lovely idea," his mother said. "Can I come?" Hannah asked. "No," Christian and his mother both said at the same time. "Are we playing Farkle tonight?" Carly asked. Hannah went to the game closet and pulled out a deck of cards. "I'm going to find a game you can't win," she said with a determined edge to her voice. "Good luck with that," Christian murmured. Finished with her pie, Carly rinsed off her plate and fork and put them in the dishwasher. That done, she rubbed her hands together like a leprechaun looking at a pot of gold. "I'll take that challenge." The next morning, when Carly went to the Haywood house, she found Mrs. Haywood sitting on a rocker on the front porch with a basket of tomatoes at her feet. Mrs. Haywood lifted a heavy eyelid, and a flicker of a smile crossed her face. "If my mama could see me, she'd have my hide. Sitting down, and it isn't even noon." Carly didn't like the scary gray color of Mrs. Haywood's skin. She dropped onto a chair beside her. "Were you picking tomatoes?" Perry dropped beside Mrs. Haywood's feet and curled into a contented ball. Mrs. Haywood bit her lip. "They're going to rot on the vine if not picked soon, Salsa doesn't make itself, you know. I can pick them for you. Mrs. Haywood patted Carly's hand. You're a good girl. Your daddy is lucky to have you for such a long extended stay. Did Mrs. Haywood not know her father was in Mexico with Micah? Surely she must know Micah wasn't home. Christian banged at the door, caught sight of Carly, and halted. Your mama needs help picking the tomatoes, Carly told him. Everyone is. Christian raked his fingers through his hair. I was going to show you the lavender fields. We can see them after we pick the tomatoes. Carly stood. Leave the dog, Mrs. Haywood demanded. He'll smash the plants. Christian opened his mouth to argue, but closed it. With firm, resolute steps, he marched around the house to the vegetable garden. Carly trotted to keep up with him. The vegetable patch, which had clearly been neglected while Mrs. Haywood was in the hospital, was a tangle of weeds, vines, and clusters of vegetables seeking out space and sun. You know, Christian said in a barely audible voice, as soon as we pick these tomatoes, she's going to start making salsa. He dropped beside a tomato cage and wrestled a red tomato in his hand. I have a good mind to just throw these all away. Carly knelt beside a neighboring tomato cage and rescued a few tomatoes. I'll make the salsa. He shot her a glance. No, you won't, he said in a hard voice. Oh, come on, it'll be fun. I'll try a bunch of different recipes. Peaches are in season over the mountain, and I've always wanted to try peach salsa. You've done enough, Christian grumbled. Carly rocked back onto her heels. Well, if you won't let me make the salsa, you need to hire someone. You know why I can't do that. Christian, she began. We're not having this conversation. Christian stood and strode away, chucking tomatoes with every step he took. Carly chased after him. Where are you going? She called. I'm taking you to the lavender fields. You can plant a garden there. I can't plant a garden on your land unless you let me lease it from you. No, he barked out the single word. Carly placed her hand on Christian's arm and pulled him to a stop. What's your problem today? He looked up at the sky. You know what my problem is. And you know I can't make that decision for you, but how about I pick the tomatoes, make the salsa, and help out your mom? Haywoods don't take charity, Christian grumbled. It's not charity. Besides, you can pay me if you'd like, although I really think you should tell your mom and your family about your situation and hire as much help as your mama needs. It's none of your business, Christian said in a hard tone before turning in the opposite direction and striding away. Carly hesitated, debating on whether to chase after him. Her gaze landed on the lavender fields. They stretched before her like a sea of rippling blue. A tiny house sat in the middle of it. Like everything else that Haywoods owned, it looked tired, sad, and neglected. For a long moment, Carly debated between continuing her argument with Christian or snooping around the house. Curiosity won. She crossed the fields in long, fast strides. The house drew her like a magnet. The porch listed to one side and squealed out a complaint when she climbed the steps. Using her sleeve, she wiped away the dust from the window to peer inside. To her surprise, she saw a dark, curly-haired child standing in the center of the room. Carly rushed to the door. Who had brought a child out here? Where were her parents? The door swung open before Carly could even touch the knob. Carly and the child eyed each other. The little girl had one blue and one brown eye. Carly's mouth dropped open. Behind her, the porch groaned. Carly whirled around to find Christian standing behind her. She swung back to face the child, but the child had disappeared. Carly's knees buckled, but she straightened her spine and strode into the house. She went to where the child had been standing. Hello? Christian followed her through the door, chuckling. There's no one here. I thought I saw someone, a child. Christian shook his head. That's impossible. Carly darted through the small house, peering in all the closets and throwing open all the cupboards. Christian stomped after her, his heavy boots shaking the floorboards. When she determined the house was empty, Carly bolted out the back porch. The lavender waved in the stiff breeze. Cold, Carly hugged her arms and watched for the child. Could she be hiding in the lavender? Had she been able to run as far as the woods? Panic touched her. Would the child try to swim the river? And what about the mountain lion? You all right? Christian stood behind her, radiating warmth and strength. Carly marched and back into the house, surveyed the small living room, strode the old-fashioned kitchen, and checked out the 3 bedrooms. "Does this place have an attic?" she asked when Christian caught up to her in the largest bedroom. "Attic?" he echoed. "How about a basement?" Christian pushed back his hat to scratch his head. "I know it doesn't have a basement, but I don't know about an attic." Carly harumphed. Christian's forehead wrinkled in concern. "You couldn't have seen a child, Carly. We're miles away from anyone." She turned to study him. "She had heterochromia." "Your eye condition?" Carly nodded. "That's pretty rare, right?" Carly had never been religious. She'd done more praying in the last 3 weeks around the Haywoods' kitchen table than she had in the first 28 years of her life. But she knew a few Bible stories and maybe 8 or so of the 10 Commandments, if she stopped to think about them. But suddenly a scripture came to mind. "I will pour out my spirit upon you all. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions." Daughters. Could she have just seen her daughter? "Carly, I'm sorry," Christian began, startling Carly out of her thoughts. She had almost forgotten he was there. She put her palm on her forehead as if to check her temperature. Was she sick? Could she have heat stroke? A few minutes ago, she'd been cold. "I don't know what to do," Christian continued, "and I don't like not knowing what to do. It's making me crazy." Carly studied him. He stared right back, meeting her gaze with an unflinching steadiness that was so typical of his personality. Strong, sturdy, good. Could she marry this man? She couldn't let one momentary delusion determine her future, could she? But gazing at Christian, she knew it hadn't been just one moment. The last 3 weeks had been filled with laughter, banter, and heartfelt discussions. "I need to tell my family," Christian continued, "especially Mama. I've talked to Pastor Leonard and..." Carly held up her hand, stopping him. He hushed. She liked that she had that sort of power over him. "Will you kiss me?" she asked. "What?" He looked adorable, confused, but adorable. "Kiss me." Carly stamped her foot and rolled her eyes. "Is it really such an impossible thing to ask?" "No," he said slyly, "not impossible. I just want to know why." "Do you need a biology lesson?" She wanted to sound flirtatious, but instead she heard impatience and maybe a touch of hysteria in her voice. "I'm not interested in being your plaything, Carly Wentworth." Carly nearly swore in frustration. Maybe she just had the most spiritual experience of her life, and here Christian Haywood thought she was horny. She wanted to kick him, scream at him, but mostly she wanted to kiss him. She launched herself at him. Christian caught her easily, swung her feet off the ground, and swept her out the door. Carly's breath hitched, and she lifted her legs to wrap them around his waist. "Where are we going?" With his arms pinning her against his chest, he carried her out into the lavender fields. The sweet, dusty air enveloped them. "The first time we kiss, we have to do it right." "Says who?" Carly asked. "Says me," Christian answered right before his lips crashed onto hers. A long time later, Carly leaned away to look him in the eyes. Was it her imagination, or did she see her future reflected there? "Do you want children?" "Yes." "A girl?" "And some boys." "Is it too soon to talk about this?" "Talk is overrated," Christian said, and he kissed her again. With Christian's lips on hers, Carly's view shifted. She saw a future of open fields, harvest baskets full of freshly grown bumper crops, and rippling lavender. She saw dark, curly-haired children darting through the apple orchards and skipping along garden paths. Warmth, joy, and longing seeped throughout her body when she realized here was the future only she and Christian could create. Hey, reader friends. I originally wrote this when I was writing Small Town Secrets, my novel, the first in my Small Town series, because I was curious about how Carly and her husband started the Haywood farm. It started off as a short story, but as time went on, I fell more and more in love with it. And there's still a lot more I want to explore. So I'm not sure I'll end here. I don't think so, but maybe. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the short story about Carly and Christian, and keep tuned because I don't think this will be the end. Thanks for coming.